Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Michaela and I'm a nutrition and life coach who specializes in helping people overcome restrictive dieting and emotional eating. So in today's video I'm going to be talking about why we get stuck in the binge restrict cycle and 4 tips to getting out of it. So the binge and restrict cycle was something that I was stuck in for a long time, and I know how emotionally draining it can be to be stuck in this habit of both restricting your diet to kind of try and make up for the binging, but also finding yourself binging again and just feeling like you're so trapped in the cycle and you can't get out of it. So that's why I really want to make today's video, to really give you some ideas on some things you can really do to start getting out of the cycle and understanding of why you could be stuck in the cycle. So I'm going to be giving you four tips that could help you in getting out of the binge and restrict cycle. But I just wanted to say that it's important. All of these tips are really important, and to just take your time and really moving through these tips one by one, because they are quite substantial things. Like, they aren't just little wee tips, they're quite big things. Just give yourself some grace when you're doing this. So one thing that really keeps us stuck in the binge restrict cycle is negative self-belief. So when we have really negative self-belief, we come out with real negative thoughts about ourselves and about situations. So for example, when we have a binge episode, we end up beating ourselves up over it and just feeling really not good. Like, we feel really crap because we're saying these really unkind things about ourselves and keeping those thought patterns going by doing it like every time that we find ourselves binging, or even in other situations where things are not going to plan, we kind of beat ourselves up over it. So this negative self-talk kind of feeds into the binge eating, because we beat ourselves up and then we find ourselves back in the same situations and we kind of continue this cycle. So it's important to stop these thoughts. Easier said than done, obviously, but to really stop, or even just start by becoming aware of these thoughts and start recognizing and asking ourselves, is this thought helpful in breaking this pattern of negative self-talk? Is this going to help me if I'm wanting to overcome the binge eating? So for example, if we're having thoughts like, after we have a binge episode, like, oh, I'm never going to be able to stop doing this, like unkind words towards ourselves and just saying, how am I ever going to get out of this? That's kind of feeding into the binge eating, because we are thinking those thoughts that are saying like, well, I'm never going to be able to do this, and it really doesn't give us the motivation to do things that could change the position that we're in. So it's important to start becoming aware of these thoughts and how helpful they are in overcoming the binge and restrict cycle. So that is tip number 1. So tip number 2, which is very similar to tip number 1, is to really stop ourselves in those thoughts and really start shifting them to be more neutral in nature. So instead of beating ourselves up over a binge episode, really asking ourselves in a non-judgmental way, even if it's easier, pretending you're speaking to a friend or something, and really being like, okay, well, this is a habit I've had for a long time. It's not going to happen overnight. I'm not going to suddenly be able to stop binge eating. That's just not how it's going to work. I know this, and I know that beating myself up and saying unkind things isn't going to be helpful. So rather than doing that, being able to think thoughts, kind of rationalize the things that have happened and look at it through a different perspective, rather than just completely real negative and just going and beating ourselves up over it like we have been. And obviously this is something that takes a lot of practice and time to be able to do, and it's just important to kind of start the process of doing this and not just feeling like you have to be stuck in these thoughts and there's no way out of it, because there is. We can really start stopping in those thoughts and really start reconsidering how helpful they are, and also how we could be thinking in a different way that would be more helpful in those situations. And that can really and should and that usually will start at a place where you're just looking at things from a neutral standpoint and looking at, what is the facts here? Does this truly make me a horrible person, or is this just something that I've become reliant on doing because I've just keep doing it for a long time? doesn't make me a horrible person. It's just something I'm struggling with right now, and that's why I'm working through these thoughts, you know? So just really not leaving it at that base level of just the negative thoughts and continuing, if that makes sense. So tip number 3 I have, which I'm going to guess you probably guessed it would be one of the tips, is to stop the restriction. Because obviously when we're in a binge restrict cycle, we probably know that the restricting isn't helping. It's probably going to make it worse. But also I remember myself when I was in the binge restrict cycle, my brain really was telling me that I was really just making up for the binge and it wouldn't affect the chances of me binging later. And while there is a lot of psychological stuff that causes us to binge, there also is a physiological side of it, when if we are restricting, we are really increasing the odds of the binge eating to happen to us. So it's a mixture of both things, but when we have even just the physical hunger, it really impacts the urgency and the amount that we can even overeat if we are actively restricting ourselves in between the binges. So, and I know for myself that obviously it was a compensation thing to try and make up for a binge episode, but we need to kind of, and a lot of those fears are around weight gain and things like that. So it's really about trying to let go of those fears of weight gain and really look at the bigger picture and realize that it's a lot bigger than just weight gain. Like, sure, even if there was some weight gain, that would be more than worth it, because we're trying to break some habits that are going to be really, really hard to break, and it is going to take uncomfortable things. We're going to have to go through uncomfortable things where we're not used to doing those things and we are used to restricting, but these are going to give us the best shot at really breaking out of these binge and restrict cycles. So yeah, that is tip number 3, is to really stop restricting and to start focusing on nourishing our body when we are really wanting to restrict and not allowing that to continue in that pattern of restricted. So obviously in the last one we talked about the physiological need that our body has for food if we're trying to restrict it, so that kind of can really impact the odds of us binging in the first place, and also how much we binge on. So it's important to address that. But the next tip that I have is around the psychological side of binging. So it's really important to understand why you are binging at that level as well. So once we've kind of worked through the restriction side of it, we can start working through the psychological side. So why is it that you are binging? Like, what is the things you're trying to avoid? Like, obviously binging turns into a habit, so it can get to a point where it doesn't even feel like you're trying to avoid anything. It just feels like it's really a strong coping mechanism in your life that you just want to turn towards, even though you don't know why you're turning towards it always. And that's part of it. That's part of what happens when you create a habit. Your mind kind of just automatically goes towards that without even really giving you the chance to kind of assess why you're turning towards it. So it's important to really break up these two instances. So when you're, what we call is the trigger, when the trigger happens, it's really important to kind of break up between when you're not binging and then the trigger happens and the binge happens. So to do this, it's really important before you go to binge to really just give yourself even a couple of minutes to just sit and write down whatever's in your head. If you feel like there's nothing in your head, still getting yourself to take those couple minutes just before you're about to binge and allowing that space to kind of try and see what is triggering it, what is causing you to want to binge at the emotional level, as well as obviously the physiological level as well. So yeah, that is tip number 4. I also did a masterclass on identifying the trigger of emotional eating, which I will leave linked below, so make sure you check that out if there is something which more often than not is part of the binge and restrict cycle. So that is all the tips I have for today. I hope you found them helpful. I know that being stuck in the binge and restrict cycle is a very isolating thing and comes with a lot of feelings negative feelings and thought patterns that really don't help the situation, and it can be really emotionally draining to be stuck in these sort of patterns. So I really do hope that you found some light even, or some sort of thing you can try out from today's video. So make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed today's video, and I will see you next week.